Jack's heart raced as he sprinted through the dusty streets, his mind clouded with fear and desperation. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, but he couldn't afford to notice the beauty. His thoughts were consumed by one thing only: Eli, his newborn son, crying in agony back at the ranch. Jack had tried everything he could think of. His milk supplies were gone. The cows had stopped producing, and the small amount of formula he had left had run dry hours ago. Eli was starving, and Jack was powerless to help him. Desperation clawed at his chest as he approached the house of Martha, a woman he barely knew but who might be his last hope. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, his knuckles trembling against the worn wood of the door. A bead of sweat dripped down his brow as he wondered if she would even let him in. Jack wasn't the type to ask for help, not from anyone, let alone a stranger. But tonight, the weight of his son's cries had shattered his pride. He needed to do whatever it took to save Eli, even if it meant swallowing his dignity. The door creaked open slowly, and Martha stood there, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his disheveled state. Jack's voice faltered as he explained the dire situation. I need milk, my son. Eli, he's starving. His throat tightened as he spoke, the words feeling foreign on his lips. He had never imagined himself in this position, begging for help from someone he didn't even know. Martha's gaze softened as she looked at him, her eyes scanning the desperation in his face, but she remained silent for a moment. Jack shifted nervously, unsure of what she would do next. Would she turn him away, or would she show him the mercy he so desperately needed? Martha's heart skipped a beat as she processed the gravity of his words. She had seen Jack around town, a quiet man with a broken demeanor, but she had never spoken to him before. The sight of him now, hunched over with exhaustion and fear, painted a picture of a father pushed to his limits. Despite her initial reluctance to get involved in someone else's problems, something deep inside her stirred. She had raised her own children years ago and knew what it meant to nourish and protect a life. It didn't matter that she barely knew Jack. The sight of him standing there, broken and vulnerable, was enough to shake her resolve. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting him in. Jack didn't hesitate, his relief palpable as he crossed the threshold into her modest home. Martha led them to the small kitchen, where the dim light from a single hanging bulb illuminated the room. She was already moving to the refrigerator, gathering what little milk she had. As she did, Jack's mind raced. How had things come to this? How had his life turned into a desperate scramble to keep his son alive? The weight of his failures crashed down on him like a heavy, suffocating blanket, but there was no time for self-pity. His son needed him. Martha turned back to him, a small carton of milk in hand. She studied him for a moment, sensing the deep-rooted pain behind his eyes. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she said quietly. Jack nodded, barely able to meet her gaze. He was too ashamed to explain the full extent of his situation. He wasn't just battling hunger for his son, he was fighting the crushing weight of his past mistakes, of debts and broken promises. But now, in this moment, there was no space for regrets. There was only Eli, the baby who needed him to be strong. Martha placed the carton of milk on the table and began to warm it up, her hands steady as she moved with practiced efficiency. Jack stood there watching her, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to rely on someone like this every day, someone who could offer comfort. When the world seemed to have turned its back on him, he had always been alone, isolated by his own pride and stubbornness. But now, as Martha prepared the milk, he felt the first flicker of hope in what seemed like an endless storm. The warmth of the milk filled the room as she handed it to him. "For your son," she said simply. Jack took the bottle from her hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He had never been one to ask for help, but now, in the face of his son's hunger, he realized that sometimes pride had to be set aside in order to save a life. Jack nodded his thanks, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, more than you know." As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night, this seemingly small act of kindness, would change everything for him and Eli. Storm outside raged on, but inside, a new chapter was beginning, one filled with uncertainty, but also with the possibility of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Jack's pulse raced as he stared at Martha, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do. My son is starving. I can't lose him." His words faltered as he struggled to hold back tears, his entire body trembling. Martha stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the weight of his plea. The silence between them was thick, pregnant with unspoken fears. She had never seen Jack in such a state before. This wasn't the quiet, reserved man she knew. This was a father at his breaking point, willing to do anything to save his child. Martha hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the small window in her kitchen. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the walls. She knew that helping Jack wasn't just about providing a bottle of milk. There was something else, something deeper that tugged at her instincts. She had lived a long life, and in her years she had learned to trust her gut. And right now, her gut was telling her that there was more to Jack's story than met the eye. His frantic state wasn't just caused by hunger. Something was hidden beneath the surface. Despite her suspicions, Martha couldn't turn him away. Her heart softened at the sight of the infant in Jack's arms, weak and frail, his face red from crying. It was a look she knew too well, the look of a child in desperate need. She moved toward him, her steps purposeful but gentle. "I'll help," she said, her voice calm but resolute. The decision weighed heavily on her, but she had already made up her mind. She would give Jack what he needed. She would do what a mother does for her child. But even as she moved to warm the milk, Martha couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about the baby. Martha prepared the milk with the efficiency of someone who had raised children of her own. But as she looked at Jack, her mind churned. Why was he alone? Why wasn't the baby's mother here, doing this herself? Why hadn't he gone to the town for help sooner? It was a question she couldn't ignore, no matter how much her compassionate heart urged her to focus on the immediate need. She glanced at Jack again, watching him as he gently rocked Eli in his arms. There was a weariness in his eyes, but something else too, something darker, perhaps even more troubling. Her heart ached for him, for Eli, but a part of her remained cautious. She had learned long ago to question the motives of those who came, asking for help, especially when it seemed like they were hiding something. Jack's story didn't add up. How could a man let things get this bad? How had his son come to be in such a fragile state? But there was no time for those questions now. There was only Eli, and in this moment, there was only compassion. Still, Martha couldn't escape the feeling that something about this night would change everything for her. With a deep breath, Martha sat down next to Jack and gently took Eli from his arms. She felt the weight of the child, his fragile body almost too much for her to bear. As she cradled him in her arms, she marveled at how small and helpless he seemed. The baby instinctively quieted, sensing the warmth of her touch. But Martha couldn't help but notice the deep pain in Jack's eyes, as if a part of him was unraveling with every passing second. He had been alone, struggling in a way she couldn't fully understand, and now he was reaching out to her, a stranger, for help. As she began to nurse Eli, a deep sense of unease settled in Martha's chest. She had never expected this, never expected to be in this position. The act of feeding him felt so intimate, yet detached, as if they were both caught in something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about nourishing the baby. It was about something deeper, a bond forming between them that felt strangely out of place. Jack's situation was not as simple as it seemed. Something had driven him to this breaking point, and Martha knew she would have to face the truth eventually. But for now, she focused on the baby in her arms, willing herself to stay in the moment, to provide what little comfort she could. As the milk warmed and Eli's tiny body responded to the nourishment, Martha's mind wandered. Was it possible that Jack was hiding something, or had his desperation simply pushed him to a place where he no longer knew how to ask for help? The questions circled in her mind, but Martha knew one thing for sure. She couldn't leave them to fend for themselves, not while this little boy still needed her. And as she held Eli, feeling his body relax in her arms, she realized that somehow, for better or worse, her life had just become intertwined with Jack's. Whatever he was running from, she would have to face it with him, for the sake of Eli. As Martha gently cradled Eli in her arms, the warmth of his small body against her chest was a sharp contrast to the cold reality that had brought them together. She took a deep breath and began to nurse him, a tender act that felt both natural and foreign at the same time. The baby's small, delicate hands instinctively gripped her shirt as he latched on, his hunger overwhelming him. But as she looked down at his innocent face, something stirred inside her. It wasn't just the act of feeding him that was making her heart swell. It was the feeling of his dependency on her, the unspoken bond between them that was already taking root. Martha had raised children of her own many years ago, but her own motherhood had always been marked by pain and loss. After her children grew up and moved away, she'd lived a quiet, solitary life, her heart hardened by years of widowhood. She'd never expected to find herself here, caring for a baby who wasn't even hers, in the midst of a crisis she didn't fully understand. Yet, as she sat there, holding Eli in her arms, a strange warmth spread through her chest. It was an instinct she had long buried, a maternal drive that was rising to the surface once more. She wasn't just feeding him. She was nurturing him, protecting him, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Jack stood quietly by the door, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he watched Martha and Eli. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place. He had never imagined this moment, never envisioned someone else feeding his son, caring for him in a way he couldn't. It was a painful reminder of his own inadequacies. His hands shook slightly as he wiped the sweat from his forehead, feeling utterly helpless in the face of his son's needs. But the sight of Martha, so effortlessly tender with Eli, gave him a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew, somehow, that he could trust her with his son. Martha's heart tightened as she continued to nurse the baby. She could feel his small breaths, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest against her own. With each passing second, the bond between them deepened, an invisible thread tying her to him in a way that she couldn't explain. It was as though she had always been meant to be there for him, meant to offer him the care and love he so desperately needed. But even as she felt this connection, a part of her remained distant, cautious. There was a reason why Jack was in this state of desperation, why his son was starving. She had to know more, had to understand what had led him to this point. As she fed Eli, Martha's mind wandered. She tried to piece together the fragments of Jack's story. The man had lost his wife. She knew that much. But what else? Why had he been so quick to ask for help, so willing to let a stranger care for his child? There was something about Jack's desperation that didn't sit right with her, a sense of something darker lurking just beneath the surface. Was he truly the innocent man he appeared to be, or was there more to his story than he was letting on? The questions kept coming, one after another, but Martha pushed them aside, focusing instead on the child in her arms. She would confront Jack later, but for now, all that mattered was Eli. Jack's gaze never left Martha as she fed Eli, his mind racing. He had been prepared for a moment of shame, a moment where he would have to beg for help, but he hadn't anticipated this way Martha had taken to his son so naturally, so effortlessly. It was as though she had been born to do this. He felt both a deep sense of relief and an undeniable sense of guilt. He wasn't supposed to be in this position. He was supposed to be the one providing, the one protecting. Yet here he was, relying on a woman he hardly knew to take care of his son. It was a humbling experience, one that he couldn't ignore. As the minutes passed, Martha's initial hesitation began to melt away. The act of caring for Eli, of feeding him, was no longer a task. It was something she wanted to do. She had been so consumed by her own loneliness and fears that she had forgotten what it felt like to give love freely, without reservation. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this feeling, how much she had longed to feel needed again. But with Eli, it was different. There was no expectation, no strings attached. She wasn't doing this for herself, she was doing it for him, and that, in itself, was enough. Jack could see the change in Martha's expression as she continued to care for Eli. Her face had softened, her posture more relaxed, as though the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders, even if just for a moment. It was a reminder of the power of compassion, of how a simple act of kindness could transform someone's life. He hadn't expected to find this kind of support, this kind of connection, in a stranger, but here it was, unfolding before him. As Martha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Jack knew that this was more than just a moment of need. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that would change their lives forever. Martha's hand gently stroked Eli's soft hair as she finished feeding him, a small sense of peace settling in her chest. She knew that her connection with him was real, even if it was still new, but in the back of her mind, the questions lingered. Jack's past, his sudden desperation, it was all too much to ignore. She had taken a step into a world she didn't fully understand, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to turn back. Not now, not with Eli in her arms. As Martha settled back into her chair, Eli now peacefully asleep in her arms, Jack stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the vast barren land that stretched before him. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Jack's voice, rough and hoarse, broke the stillness. "My wife, she died giving birth to Eli," he said quietly, as though the words themselves held a weight too heavy to bear. Martha's heart clenched at the sorrow in his voice, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "She was everything to me. I don't know how I'm supposed to do this without her." His hands gripped the windowsill tightly, his knuckles white. Martha could see the strain in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief. Jack paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his eyes focused on something far off in the distance, yet not really seeing it. "I had no choice but to keep going. Eli needed me. I tried to keep the farm going, tried to raise him on my own, but it wasn't enough. The land, the crops, the animals, it all started slipping away. The debts piled up, and I couldn't keep up. I'm afraid I'm losing everything, Martha." The words were difficult for him to say, and Martha could hear the rawness in his tone. She didn't respond immediately, letting the gravity of his confession settle in. There was something more to his words, something he wasn't saying, but Martha sensed it was just the tip of the iceberg. Martha's mind raced as she absorbed the information. She had known Jack's life wasn't easy, but the depth of his struggle was clearer now. The death of his wife, the overwhelming burden of raising a child alone, and the relentless pressure of mounting debts, it was too much for one person to handle. But as she listened to Jack, a nagging feeling began to rise in her chest. There was something hidden in his story, something unspoken. The way he had avoided mentioning specific details about the debts, the way his eyes darkened when he spoke of the farm, it all pointed to a deeper, more complex problem than simple financial ruin. Jack wasn't just struggling with poverty, he was grappling with something darker, something that had pushed him to the edge. She didn't want to pry, but Martha knew that she couldn't ignore the unease building inside her. Jack's situation wasn't just a matter of bad luck or misfortune. His grief, his fear of losing everything, there was something more behind it, something that went beyond the surface of financial hardship. Martha studied him as he spoke, noting the way his gaze flickered with uncertainty and guilt. It was as if he were hiding a secret, one that he wasn't ready to share. She had to wonder what had really happened to his wife. What was the true nature of the debts that haunted him? There was more to Jack's past than he was letting on, and Martha couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would eventually come to light, whether he was ready for it or not. As Martha continued to nurse Eli, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. The act was simple, just a mother feeding her child, but the connection she felt with him was anything but ordinary. She had never imagined herself in this role, never thought she would find herself caring for someone else's child in this way. It wasn't just a sense of responsibility, it felt like something deeper, something instinctual that went beyond mere compassion. There was an undeniable bond forming between her and Eli, a bond that seemed to transcend the physical act of nursing. It was as if the very act of feeding him was awakening something inside of her that had been dormant for years. She wasn't used to this kind of closeness. She had lived most of her life in solitude, her heart shielded by years of disappointment and loss. There were no children of her own, no family to speak of, just a quiet, empty house where she had spent countless nights alone. The thought of motherhood had always seemed like an impossible dream, one she had long buried after her own painful childhood. Her mother had never been there for her, never offered the love or warmth that every child needed. Martha had learned early on to fend for herself, to find comfort in her own strength rather than in the arms of others. But now, with Eli in her arms, something was shifting inside of her, and she wasn't sure how to process it. As she gazed down at the baby, she couldn't help but feel a wave of conflicting emotions. There was love, yes, but it was different from the love she had known in the past. It was pure, untainted by the bitterness and regret that had colored so much of her life, but there was also something else, a sense of unease, an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake. It was as if the bond she was forming with Eli wasn't entirely her own, as though something more was at play. Her mind wandered, and she found herself questioning whether there was something supernatural happening between them, something she couldn't explain. The connection felt too strong, too immediate, to be merely the result of her nurturing instincts. In the midst of these swirling thoughts, Martha's mind flashed back to her own childhood. The memories came in fragments, quick, jarring glimpses of a young girl who had never known the comfort of a mother's embrace. Her mother had been distant, cold, consumed by her own struggles. Martha had been left to navigate the world on her own, her needs ignored, her cries unheard. It was a painful reminder of what she had never received. And as she held Eli, she couldn't help but wonder, was this love she was feeling for him a response to the love she had never gotten as a child? Had she spent her entire life searching for something she could never find, only to find it now, in the arms of a child who wasn't even hers? As the visions of her childhood faded, Martha felt a deep sense of confusion settle in her chest. She had always believed that she was in control of her own fate, that she had built a life for herself on her own terms. But now, with Eli in her arms, she couldn't help but question everything. Could her life be leading her somewhere else? Was this moment, this connection with Eli, somehow tied to her destiny? She had never been a spiritual person, never believed in fate or destiny. But now, she found herself wondering if the universe had brought her here for a reason. If there was some greater purpose to her involvement with Jack and his son. The more Martha thought about it, the more she felt a strange sense of inevitability about the situation. She had always prided herself on her independence, on the fact that she didn't need anyone. But now, with Eli's tiny body in her arms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. A need for connection, for love, for something more than the empty existence she had built for herself. Was this the reason she had been so alone for all these years? Was her solitude part of a larger plan, one that had led her to this moment, to this child? And what would happen when she finally accepted that she was meant to be a part of Eli's life, and Jack's, in ways she hadn't yet fully understood? As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, Martha felt a gentle stirring in Eli's small body. He was awake, his tiny hands grasping at her shirt, his eyes looking up at her with an expression of pure trust. She felt a surge of affection for him, a protective instinct she couldn't explain. She had never felt anything like this before, not for a child, not for anyone. It was as if her heart had opened to him in a way it never had before, and she realized, with a sudden clarity, that she would do anything to keep him safe. The love she felt for him wasn't just a maternal instinct, it was something deeper, something that felt fated. The feeling of destiny settled over her like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just about Eli. It was about the journey she was now on, one that was bound up with Jack's and his sons. She had been so focused on surviving, on protecting herself from the hurts of the past, that she had failed to see the path that had been laid out for her. Perhaps this was why she had spent so many years in isolation, to prepare her for this moment, to teach her what it meant to love without reservation. And as she looked down at Eli, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was part of something much larger, something she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but one that would change her forever. Martha's heart beat a little faster as she continued to cradle Eli, feeling the weight of the realization settle deeper into her bones. She wasn't just helping Jack anymore, she was becoming something more, a mother, a protector, a woman tied to this child and his father in a way she couldn't yet explain. The loneliness that had defined so much of her life was starting to fade, replaced by something richer, more meaningful, and for the first time in years, Martha allowed herself to consider the possibility that perhaps she had found the love she had longed for, not in the past, but in the very moment she was living. As the days passed, Martha found herself becoming more deeply entrenched in Eli's life. What had started as a simple act of kindness feeding the child had evolved into something much more complicated. Each day, as she spent more time with him, a deep, protective love began to grow within her. At first, it had been just about caring for him, meeting his basic needs. But now, as she held him close, as she soothed his cries and rocked him to sleep, she realized that she had become more than just a caregiver. She was attached to him in a way she hadn't expected. The bond between them had deepened, and she couldn't ignore it. Martha began to question everything. She had never seen herself as a mother. She had never wanted children of her own, not after the painful experiences of her childhood. Her mother had been cold, emotionally distant, and Martha had grown up learning to fend for herself, to suppress any need for affection. She had never believed in the notion of destiny or fate, yet here she was, tied to a child who wasn't hers. Her feelings for Eli were so strong, so natural, that they frightened her. Was this what motherhood was supposed to feel like? Was she just experiencing a temporary emotional reaction? Or was this something deeper, something that would change her forever? As she pondered these questions, Martha couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward Eli that she had never felt before. She had spent so many years alone, buried in her work and her solitude, that she had never truly allowed herself to love someone else. But now, it was different. There was no denying the overwhelming sense of attachment she felt toward Eli had become a part of her life in a way that was undeniable, and she could no longer separate herself from the role she had assumed. In a strange way, she had become his mother, whether she was ready for it or not. Jack's presence loomed in her thoughts as well. While he had become a crucial part of this equation, the more time Martha spent with Eli, the more she found herself drawn into Jack's world. His pain, his struggle, his fear of losing everything, it had become her own burden as well. She had entered his life to help, but now, she was more involved than she had ever expected. She had never been one to get emotionally involved with others' problems, but Jack's desperation had burrowed its way into her heart. She couldn't help but wonder, was she only helping because it gave her a sense of purpose, or was there something more to her involvement with him? Martha found herself at a crossroads. As her relationship with Eli deepened, she began to realize that she could no longer stand on the sidelines. She had become a part of their lives, whether she liked it or not. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her future was no longer her own. Eli needed her, and Jack, whether he realized it or not, was relying on her. She had tried to maintain her emotional distance, to keep herself from getting too involved, but it had proven impossible. Every day, she grew more connected to them, both, and with that connection came a sense of obligation, a duty she had never expected to feel. Her mind was a whirl of emotions. As she tried to balance her feelings for Eli with the realities of her life, she couldn't just walk away from them. She couldn't pretend that the bond she had formed wasn't real. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the fact that she had her own life, her own identity. She had worked hard to carve out a life for herself, one where she was in control, where no one depended on her. Yet now, she felt herself slipping further into a role she had never asked for, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. Could she give up her independence to care for Eli, to become a mother figure to him? And if so, what would that mean for her future? Martha's thoughts were clouded with doubt, but there was a small, quiet voice inside her that kept pushing her forward. She couldn't deny the love she felt for Eli, nor could she ignore the responsibility that had become hers. But could she truly sacrifice her own life, her own desires, for this child? She couldn't pretend to have all the answers, but one thing was certain: her path had changed. She could no longer walk away from the role she had taken on, no matter how difficult it might be. The choices she made from here on out would shape her future in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the days blurred into weeks, Martha found herself at a breaking point. The life she had once known, the life of solitude, of emotional independence, was no longer an option. She had to decide whether she was willing to fully embrace her new role as a mother figure to Eli, whether she could open herself up to the idea of raising a child who wasn't her own. And as much as she fought against it, as much as she struggled to keep her emotions in check, she knew deep down that her future was bound up with Jack and Eli's in ways she couldn't deny. The decisions she made now would determine not just their lives but her own as well. Martha sat in silence one evening, Eli asleep in her arms, staring out the window at the setting sun. The weight of her choices hung heavy on Martha's shoulders, pressing down with an unbearable intensity. She had come to the farm with no intention of becoming entangled in the complexities of Jack's life. She had only sought to offer a brief, the moment of respite for a man overwhelmed by loss and hardship, but somewhere along the way, that simple act of kindness had snowballed, pulling her into a world of fear, guilt, and danger. She had always seen herself as someone who was in control of her own destiny, never one to get involved in other people's struggles. But now, she was irrevocably changed. The Martha who had stepped onto the farm with her own quiet life had faded into the woman who, whether she liked it or not, was tied to Jack and his son. The love she felt for Eli was no longer something fleeting or temporary. It had become a force within her. This love wasn't just a passing emotion, it was something permanent, something that would define the rest of her days. As she lay awake that night, holding Eli close, Martha knew in her heart that no matter what choice she made in the days to come, she was forever tied to this family. Jack, seemingly aware of the burden he had placed on her, finally opened up. His words were hesitant, broken, as though he feared even speaking them out loud. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. Martha felt a chill settle in her chest. She had always known that there was more to Jack's story than he had let on, but the weight of the secrets he had been hiding began to sink in. Jack spoke of a man named Victor Rojas, someone he owed much more than just money. Victor, Jack's voice faltered. "I made a deal with him a long time ago. I thought I could pay him back in time, but it's never that simple with him. He doesn't just want money, Martha, he wants control." His words sent a shockwave through Martha. The realization that they were in danger not only from Jack's debts but from a powerful, dangerous man named Victor Rojas hit her like a slap to the face. Victor Rojas was no ordinary creditor. He was a man of ruthless power, feared by everyone who knew him. As Jack's voice shook with a mixture of fear and regret, Martha began to understand the full extent of the threat they were facing. Jack had always been terrified of Victor, but she hadn't fully grasped the depth of that fear until now. Victor wasn't just some businessman seeking payment. He was a man who operated on intimidation and control, a man who would stop at nothing to ensure his dominance. Jack's life had been consumed by this fear, and now Eli was caught in the crossfire. Martha's mind raced as she tried to comprehend what kind of man Victor Rojas was and what he could do to them. She had heard rumors, stories of his ruthlessness, but now, those whispers felt far too real. The weight of the situation began to dawn on her. Their lives, once simple and predictable, had been appended by a past that Jack had tried to outrun but could never escape. Martha couldn't ignore the growing realization that Jack's past had shaped everything they were now facing. His decisions, made years ago, had led them to this point. His desperation, his inability to escape the grip of Victor Rojas, had entangled them both in a web of violence and threats. Jack's confession that the pact he had made with Victor was a mistake, a decision that had cost him everything, rang in Martha's ears. She could see now that this wasn't just about paying back a debt, it was about survival. Victor wasn't just after Jack's money, he wanted complete control over his life, and he would go to any lengths to get it, including taking Eli. Martha's heart sank as she processed the grim reality. This wasn't just Jack's battle anymore, it was her battle too. Eli's safety, their survival, depended on decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. The weight of the choices Martha now faced felt like a crushing burden. How far would Victor go? How much power did he truly have over their lives? As Jack's desperation became clearer with each passing day, Martha knew that they couldn't outrun Victor forever. They were trapped, and their only choice was to face the man who held the strings of their fates. Yet, the more she learned about Jack's entanglement, the more she realized that they were no longer just dealing with a financial crisis. They were in the midst of a deadly game, one that had been set in motion long before she had stepped into their lives. What had seemed like an act of charity, a simple kindness to a struggling father, had now become something much bigger, something Martha was no longer sure she could escape. Determined to understand more, Martha began her own investigation into Jack's past. As she spoke to people who had known him before the farm, she uncovered troubling truths. The story of Jack's wife's death, which he had always described as a tragic accident during childbirth, was far more sinister than she had been led to believe. Whispers of a car accident, far too convenient, began to surface, and it soon became clear that Jack's wife had been caught up in something far darker than a simple misfortune. The debts Jack had accumulated, the shady deals he had made, had eventually led to his wife's untimely death. She had been a victim of his past choices, caught in the crossfire of a man who had tried to outrun his debts, only to drag his family into the mess he had created. The more Martha uncovered, the more it became clear that Jack's life was deeply entangled in illegal dealings long before he ever set foot on the farm. She learned of the dangerous business transactions, the trades of land and people, that had come to define Jack's existence. His wife's death was not a tragic accident. It was the result of the dangerous web he had woven, a consequence of his choices that he had never fully come to terms with. Martha began to feel a deep, gnawing guilt. She had come into this situation thinking she was offering a simple act of kindness to a man in need, but now, she saw that she had been drawn into a far more complex and dangerous world than she had ever imagined. With every new detail Martha uncovered, the more she realized that Jack's past was not just a collection of bad decisions, it was a tangled web of deceit, manipulation, and violence that had followed him everywhere he went. His past was the root of all the danger they were now facing, and it was something they could never fully escape. What had once seemed like a simple favor, a compassionate act to help a struggling father, had now grown into a responsibility that Martha couldn't run from. She had become a part of Jack's dark world, whether she liked it or not. And as the reality of their situation set in, Martha knew that there was no turning back. The choices they made now would determine not only their survival but the safety of the family. They had built together ChatGPT as Martha delved deeper into Jack's past. The weight of the discovery became unbearable. She learned that Jack had been involved in numerous illegal deals, using land and sometimes even people to settle debts that he had accumulated over the years. What had seemed like a simple, financially troubled man trying to keep his farm afloat turned out to be the surface of a much darker reality. The death of Jack's wife, which had always been presented as a tragic accident during childbirth, was revealed to be something far more sinister. It was just the first casualty in a story full of powerful, dangerous enemies, men who had been wronged by Jack's deals and who would stop at nothing to collect what was owed. The further Martha dug, the more she realized that Jack's past wasn't merely the consequence of bad luck. It was the result of criminal actions that had slowly but surely come back to haunt him. Martha had initially felt sympathy for Jack as a grieving father, someone lost in the wake of tragedy. She had seen his struggles as just another example of life's unfairness. But now, as the pieces of his past began to fit together, she saw the complexity of his situation. His desperate actions weren't the result of some unfortunate series of events. They were the outcome of decades of deceit, manipulation, and choices that had put not only him but also Eli at risk. As Martha came to terms with the full scope of Jack's past, guilt began to gnaw at her. She felt foolish for not realizing the danger sooner, for not seeing that helping Jack could entangle her in a situation that would quickly spiral out of control. But now, it was too late to turn back. Her life, too, had become part of this dangerous puzzle. With each new revelation, Martha's understanding of Jack's actions became clearer, and she realized that his fear wasn't just about protecting his farm or avoiding bankruptcy. It was about escaping the shadow of his past, a past that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. The debts, the broken promises, and the enemies he had made were no longer things Jack could outrun. The more Martha learned, the more she saw that she had been dragged into a fight that wasn't just about survival, but about something much bigger: Jack's need to escape the consequences of his actions. She felt sick to her stomach as the enormity of it all hit her. The decision she had made to help this family, to step in and provide comfort, had pulled her into a situation far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. What she thought was a simple act of kindness had now become a struggle for survival, not just for Jack, but for herself and Eli as well. The more Martha became entangled in Jack's life, the more she felt as if there was no turning back. What had begun as a compassionate gesture had transformed into a burden she wasn't sure she could bear. Every day, the threat of Victor Rojas, the man who controlled Jack's fate, grew closer. Martha realized that her involvement with Jack and Eli was no longer just about helping them get by. It was about ensuring their survival in the face of a force much more powerful than anything she had ever dealt with. The shadow of Victor's influence had grown darker, and it was now threatening everything Martha had come to care for. Her quiet, independent life had been irrevocably altered, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her like a vice. There were moments when she wanted to walk away, to leave the mess Jack had created and reclaim her own life. But the bond she had formed with Eli, his innocent eyes, the love she had begun to feel for him, held her in place, anchoring her to a reality she had never expected to face. Jack, in his desperation, became more erratic. He was no longer the man she had first encountered, calm, thoughtful, and at least somewhat composed. Now, he was broken and fearful, driven by a need to protect his son from the looming threat of Victor Rojas. As Jack's panic mounted, he turned to Martha for help, pushing her further into the chaos of his life. He begged her to help him confront Victor, to take a stand against the man who had destroyed everything Jack had worked for. His plea was raw, desperate, and filled with a kind of urgency that Martha couldn't ignore. She was torn between her loyalty to Jack and the overwhelming fear of what might happen if they confronted Victor head-on. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, to protect herself and Eli from the danger that was closing in on them. But something in her refused to let go. Martha's principles, which had always been her guiding force, were now being tested in ways she could never have imagined. The choices before her felt agonizing. Should she continue down this path, sacrificing her own peace of mind and security to protect a family she barely knew? Or should she walk away, taking the safe route, and risk losing everything she had come to care for? The decision felt impossible. She had entered this world out of compassion, but now it was clear that her involvement had grown far more complicated. She wasn't just helping Jack anymore, she was deeply embedded in the tangled mess of his past, a past that threatened to consume them all. But as much as she wanted to run, Martha knew that her connection to Eli, to this family, had become something she couldn't abandon. In the end, Martha made a decision that surprised even her. She stayed. The bond she had formed with Eli was something she couldn't walk away from, no matter how much danger it might bring. And Jack, despite his flaws and mistakes, had become a part of her life that she couldn't just discard. They would face the storm together. The road ahead would be fraught with peril, and Martha knew that there were no guarantees of safety or success. But she also knew that, no matter what happened, she couldn't abandon this family. Her role had changed from outsider to protector, from someone looking in to someone deeply invested in their survival. She held Eli tightly, vowing to do whatever it took to keep him safe from the threats that loomed over them. In this fractured family, Martha had found something she hadn't expected, a purpose that gave her strength and the will to fight. Martha's decision to stay wasn't born from a sense of obligation. It was a choice rooted in love and a deep sense of responsibility. As she looked at Eli, sleeping peacefully in her arms, she realized that the world she had once known was gone. There was no going back to the life she had before. She was now part of something bigger, something far more dangerous, but also far more meaningful. She had crossed a line, and there was no retreat. The future was uncertain, and the threats were very real. But Martha had already made up her mind. She would fight, for Jack, for Eli, and for herself.